Hi friends! In school, did you ever have to do community service? Have discussions in the classroom on values such as respect, honesty, or punctuality? Have to read fables or stories that had a lesson attached to it? Saw sex ed or health classes? If so, you experienced character education in some form or another. Last video, I talked about some issues with JROTC and concluded with a question. Is the role of the military to teach values to children and young adults? Can the values it teaches be divorced from the ideology of an organization that profits and is sustained by constant war, violence, and aggression? To approach this question, I thought it might help to zoom out a little bit and ask a slightly different question. Is it the school's job to teach children values and morals? If so, who decides what values should be taught and through which methods? The attempt to teach children traits and values is often called character education. It's so prevalent and woven into the fabric of what is taught and how schools work that it'd be hard to estimate how many schools and educational programs employ it, especially in America. Let me give you an example of the reach that character education programs have. When I was researching for this video, I kept remembering this book I read very often when I was a kid called The Children's Book of Values, which of course had a different name in Spanish. In the book, there were several short stories and poems which had some lesson at the end. The stories were spread out across 4 sections, each part representing a group of related values that the book was trying to teach. The book kept coming to my mind because I was wondering how much of my research relates to my own experience. I think doing research you can't relate to is a really boring activity. So after spending some time thinking about it, I realized that this was an example of character education. Even as a person studying in, granted, partly in a US system, but outside of the US. And it's not just a book. In school, we had to do community service, which is a form of service learning. And in my last years there, we had a school-wide interdisciplinary program in which we had to read Stephen Covey's 7 Habits for the Highly Effective Teenager. At some point, I also completed catechism for my first communion at a local church, where we were taught morality through songs, stories, and prayers. And also cartoons and children's television shows were always, and still are always, trying to teach children lessons about life and the world. On one hand, I think that this is nice. There's this effort constantly being made by adults to prepare us to deal with problems, and I know some of the lessons I learned, and even cliched lessons like be yourself, or friendships are the most important, or apologizing is always difficult but usually worth it, have helped me in some situations. As I grow older, it seems more and more obvious that all our lives we're constantly being told everyone's perspective of what life is for and how to live it. I think that instead of the guides for the future that adults intend them to be, they're useful more as a way to understand and express our experiences after we've had them. That means that not all the things we learn fit to everyone, because everyone's point of view and experiences differ to the point of seeming to suggest completely contradictory things about what life is all about. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Morality has been a part of children's education since Aesop, and probably even further than that. It's a key component to religious education, though in that case it's usually referred to as moral education. It'd be an understatement to say that religion has played an important role in the development of US society. At the risk of oversimplifying, people came to populate and colonize in the Mayflower due to a religious schism caused by one group of people who didn't agree with the teachings and practices of another group of people. If you read anything about the first pilgrims, like for example the Scarlet Letter, you know the deep role that morality played in these settlements. Being able to read and interpret the scripture was an important part of the pilgrims' religious practice. The Massachusetts Act of 1642 required parents and masters to give their children a basic education and literacy, and also make sure they knew the principles of religion and the laws of the Commonwealth. After many neglected those responsibilities, another act was passed in 1647, and was the beginning of the public school system. Now known as the Old Luther-Satan Act, it required towns with more than 50 households to hire a teacher. The act, by the way, was named after its first paragraph, which reads, it being one chief project of that old deluder, Satan, to keep men from the knowledge of the Scriptures, as in former times, by keeping them in an unknown tongue, so in these latter times by persuading from the use of tongues, that so that at least the true sense and meaning of the original might be clouded and corrupted with false glosses of saint-seeming deceivers, and to the end that learning may not be buried in the grave of our forefathers, in church and commonwealth, the Lord assisting our endeavors. Not only was a public school system created to keep Satan away from children, but also to throw some shade at the Catholic religion, which at the time was still primarily in Latin, meaning most people couldn't read the Scriptures or understand most of what was said in Mass. Both saving children from perdition, whether religious or secular, and using education to oppose people who think differently are recurring features in the history of U.S. education. I don't intend for this to be a history of the U.S. education system, but hopefully all of this backstory clearly illustrates the important role that religious ideas played on the public education system as a whole. As immigrants started to establish themselves in the United States, they also established schools according to their faiths, like Catholic schools. Many politicians saw the public education system as a way to integrate newcomers into U.S. culture, including the U.S. Protestant faith. Some saw it as something positive for them, to give them enough resources and background knowledge to succeed in U.S. society, while others saw immigration as a cause for moral degradation and education as its antidote. We can see all of this reflected on the history of the Pledge of Allegiance. What started out as a pledge for internationalism and universal unity written by a socialist eventually became a patriotic flag salesman's strategy to sell more flags in schools. What was my flag to reflect all flags eventually became the flag of the United States. One nation under God was later appended as well. The idea was that as the children of immigrants came into American society, they weren't pledging to the flags of their parents' home country, but instead were assimilated into United States society and were being made aware of the reigning system of belief. All of this happened gradually, and by World War II, as more immigrants came to the United States, there was a push for the Jeffersonian idea of separation of church and state to be felt more deeply in schools. This led to many rejecting the idea of morality in the classroom because it is a concept strongly related to religion. However, many still felt that children still needed to be taught how to behave and what to aspire to be, beyond a collection of facts or practical abilities. There was a shift. Policymakers, educators, politicians, they called for character education, devoid, at least on the surface, of religious implications. The interesting part was how Bill Clinton and George W. Bush, despite being on opposite parties of the political spectrum, both geared their school reforms towards character education. They both believed that schools had to teach children to be better citizens. It's funny because, again, I am reminded of my own education. Obviously, both Clinton and Bush probably only had American citizens in mind. In my own school, the mission statement was to form citizens of the world. The idea of citizenship and citizen education is very intimately related not just to JROTC, because we can't forget its two main aims, teaching leadership and citizenship, but to the armed forces in general. We'll talk about JROTC a little bit later and discuss character education programs in general so we can put it into context. So, I told you that I kept thinking about the Children's Book of Values, right? Well, I decided to look it up, and it turns out that its author, William J. Bennett, had been a previous Secretary of Education under Ronald Reagan. He was a conservative and a religious man who criticized school curriculum and supported classical education. So what I find amazing is that I, living outside of the United States, reading a book in Spanish, was somehow also influenced by all of this history. I think Americans often fail to appreciate how influential their ideas really are, not because they're better than the ones found in the rest of the world, but because they have a lot of reach, especially now with all this technology at our disposal. The voice that Americans and their media have is loud and often overpowering. But again, I digress. Character education proposals are sometimes justified by the cries of moral degradation of society. This is as true now as it was towards the end of the 18th and beginning of the 19th century. Let's just take a look at what some educators had to say more than 100 years ago. Moral education is one of the most important problems before us in educational circles today. We are claiming that school prepares us for life. If this is so, it must train for the moral responsibilities, problems, and duties of efficient citizenship. The Church, once a strong force in moral education, has largely lost its hold, the home. Where in the old days religious and moral instruction was given, it is now too often only a 4-room flat in which the children hardly ever see their father. City life, with few opportunities for helpful play, and none of the tasks of chores which test out a child's moral character in the country. All these modern movements intensify the need of moral education in schools. This is from the Journal of Education distributed by Boston University. Somehow it's comforting to know that it's not just now. Even now in 1941, people were complaining about their version of millennials. The Columbine massacre happened during the Clinton administration, and the Bush administration was beset by many examples of school violence. The conversation in both of these cases seemed to be geared towards using school reforms as a preventive measure. This is still seen today, although as the public has grown increasingly cynical of school reforms, the public conversation seems to have shifted towards asking for tighter gun control. An interesting correlation emerges between increased incidents of school violence and shootings and calls from policymakers, politicians, students, and educators for character education in the classroom. On one hand, this is due to a larger cultural conversations happening, encompassing the fear of moral degradation of society, criticisms aimed at violent media, and culture wars between progressives and conservatives. On the other hand, it can be more convenient for the interests of some to direct the conversation away from policy changes such as more stringent gun control regulations and instead focus on education as prevention. A few years before Columbine, in his 1997 State of the Union address, Bill Clinton voiced his belief in the importance of teaching values in schools. After winning the 2001 election, George W. Bush's transitional team received recommendations from Character Counts, a coalition of 457 communities, schools, and non-profit organizations whose unifying aim is to teach the 6 pillars of character. Among those recommendations, there were increased funding for the program to $24 million and naming a full-time director of character education to serve in the Department of Education. In 2006, after 15 people had been killed in school violence in the past school year alone, Bush participated in a discussion for school safety, where he heard many proposals that range from profiling potential shooters to increasing campus security, either with metal detectors or security personnel, to student watchdog groups. However, the intersection between character education, religion, perceived moral degradation, and school violence was the clearest in a speech given by a survivor of the Columbine massacre and whose sister had been a victim. We'll get to that by the end of the video. But now, let's just look at the larger cultural conversation happening. So, character education is really just one piece of the so-called culture wars. And by that I mean the tension that exists between people who hold a more conservative and traditional view and to those who tend towards more liberal and progressive ones. So cultural criticism can come from either side, which is exactly why we see both Bill Clinton, a Democrat, and George W. Bush, a Republican, both agree that culture should be influenced through education reforms. The difference is in the approach each side decides to take. Some conservative-minded folk, like William J. Bennett, who I mentioned before, might see the need to introduce religion or the teaching of religious values in schools. Others, like Arthur J. Schwartz, believe that children can learn essential character traits from memorizing proverbs and common culture factoids. Then you have JROTC instructors, policymakers that support the program, parents, and cadets who might believe that the military might be a way, if not the only way, for kids in at-risk communities to learn about leadership, discipline, or courage. Then, on the other hand, organizations like the one inside the network I worked for might feel that militarization of education and youth culture is not only a dangerous trend that only exacerbates violence and war, but it's part of the problem instead of being a solution. I think no one can deny that the world right now is violent and often vile for both children and adults, especially for those at risk, people of color, women, queer folk, LGBTQ+, and those belonging to the working class. The question is instead, what exactly do we mean when we want school reforms to lead to a better world? What does better mean? And how can we achieve it through education? Because what is good looks different to different people. Republicans and Democrats, liberals and conservatives, everyone can agree that they want what's best for the children and society, but it's much more difficult to agree on what that even looks like. Lack of consensus is, in fact, one of the main criticisms made consistently against character education. No one can decide what good character is, what traits it has, or what values should be prioritized. I mentioned before my school's focus on the 7 habits, which are, as named in the books, be proactive, begin with the end in mind, put first things first, think win-win, seek first to understand, then to be understood, synergize, and sharpen the saw. Then we look at the traits involved in the children's book of values, which are courage, perseverance, responsibility, work, self-discipline, compassion, faith, sincerity, loyalty, and friendship. And the values taught in JROTC, which are loyalty, duty, respect, selfless service, honor, integrity, and personal courage. And the ones included in character counts, which are trustworthiness, respect, responsibility, fairness, caring, and citizenship. So we see here that although there is some overlap, we can see that each program positions certain things over others. These last 3 not only come from the same country and culture, but similar political positions. So imagine the diversity that can exist across the US. Even the definitions of essential values are deeply relative. As an example, we can look at China, where morality and education have a very long history together. Confucius, the famous philosopher and moralist, influenced not just government structure and school curriculum, but also defined good and proper traits that any judicious person should have. Filial piety, humanness, and ritual. If Confucius were to design the character education course for schools today, it looked much different than the ones I gave as an example before. The point that I want to make is that morality is deeply relative, even within one culture or society. It's hard to separate the ideas of what bits and pieces make up good character from what is good, period. And it's difficult to separate that from a point of view about how the world works and how it should work. Because everyone has different opinions, and it's very hard to come up with a trait that everyone can agree on. Talking about character education is not talking about one single program or unified plan, but instead many different proposals. JROTC is one such proposal. I agree that some of the values it teaches are good for any individual to possess, but then I wonder, who is defining these values? What point of view do these definitions support? When JROTC and other programs talk about traits like courage or loyalty, I wonder, courage to do what? Loyalty to whom? Can terrorists, who are often under-equipped when they do awful things and are almost certain of being apprehended or dying, be considered courageous? Can we use loyalty to describe their devotion to leaders and doctrines that order them to kill or harm other people? So why is the fact that JROTC is a character education program even that important? Well, now we have a context, a place of reference. Everything we see is embedded on a larger social and cultural conversations, both as a result and a continuation of them. In the case of JROTC, we can now safely say that no, it's not the only program in the US like it. No, it's not unprecedented, both in its result or what it teaches. As a character education program, it is part of the debates that question their logic and effectiveness. So we previously highlighted 3 particular areas in character education debates. Who chooses the values and to what purpose? What techniques are used to ensure the values are taught? What is the overall effectiveness of these techniques? The 3 branches of the military have different textbooks and lessons, but ultimately they teach the 7 Army values, which we mentioned before. Together, they form the acronym LEADERSHIP. and they, along with leadership and citizenship, are the ostensive main components of the character part of the program. Both of these are taught, giving kids opportunities to take control of drills and routines, as well as to the study of history and civics. Additionally, they lean heavily into service learning, picking up trash, cleaning local parks, visiting local nursing homes, and other similar activities. While having similar opportunities to do these activities through local church groups, many kids prefer the JROTC approach. Gina Perez, who I mentioned a great deal in the last episode of this series, suggests that this is because of what she calls JROTC exceptionality, the narrative that instructors, cadets, parents, and other teachers have regarding the program, in which being a part of JROTC means you are a part of something greater and in turn places a greater responsibility on you to rise up to the challenge. Perez also points out something very interesting: how much of what the kids and instructors have to say about the program responds to a neoliberal narrative of personal accountability above all. I agree that people should be held accountable for their actions, but what I'm worried about is that this point of view places the individual above the cultural and social. Like with the classical idea of the American dream, it's a thought that if you work hard enough, you'll overcome all obstacles and be able to make it. The opposite end of this is, if you fail, it is because you did not try hard enough. This point of view ignores many factors that may give some greater or lesser opportunities to fail. A lot of social problems in the US are justified or ignored because this point of view is the pervasive one. That poor people are only poor because they don't try hard enough, that there are only a few people of color or women in the movie or music industry, for instance, because they haven't worked as hard as men or aren't as interested, that successful and rich people deserve their wealth because they worked hard for it. By ignoring large factors, a society of inequality is justified, even in the minds of kids who are the most affected by it. Additionally, it's already dangerous, in my opinion, to teach values as being universal, and even more so when it comes from an institution whose main persuasive strategies are that American values are superior and universal. This is all a lot to unpack, so I'll just leave you with one more thing. We talked before about the tragedy at Columbine and how character education was used as a way to divert the conversation away from gun control topics. This clip is one of the tragedy survivors giving a speech before George W. Bush at an education conference with the aim to find a solution to gun violence in schools. In his speech, we see the intersection of religion, morality, character, and fear of cultural degradation that is reflective of everything we talked about in this video. So, definitely take a look.
Once upon a time, our goal of education in our country was first and foremost character. Academic achievement is now the main goal. I knew two students at Columbine that had achieved the goal of knowledge. Eric Harris and Dylan Klebel were very smart. They planned the shooting for a year and predicted the events that would unfold afterwards. The problem wasn't their education at my school, Columbine. Their problem was their character. I've grown up in a culture today that doesn't teach me anything of substance, of value. Hollywood bombards me every day with messages of emptiness and shallowness, and the youth are crying for something to stand for, something to believe in. If it weren't for my faith or my family, I possibly could have fallen to the lies that our culture tells us. I challenge every teacher, principal, and superintendent and educator here today. Take a look at teaching that doesn't just teach the head, but teaches the heart. The students today that I've met are looking for truth. You can help point them to what's right and what's wrong. Truth is not all relative, despite what our culture, our pop culture, tells us. To the lawmakers and politicians who want to slap those Band-Aids on deep gaping wounds, I'm simply going to repeat a poem that my dad read to the House Judiciary of Congress several months after the Columbine shooting, where he said, "Your laws ignore our deepest needs. Your words are empty air. You've stripped away our heritage. You've outlawed simple prayer. Now gunshots fill our classrooms and precious children die. You seek for answers everywhere and ask the question why. You regulate restrictive law through legislative creed, and yet you fail to understand that God is what we need. I'm not promoting that religion be brought back to schools. I don't believe that's the answer, but I do believe in education that touches and teaches the heart and helps form the character, and I believe if that can be implemented in the education on a daily basis, we'll see a change.
Thanks again for watching, and I hope that you enjoyed this video. I'd love to hear all your comments and suggestions. Thank you for watching. Bye!